Hi, everyone. J.R. Forresteros here from Catalyst Church, and it is Holy Week. Yesterday was Palm Sunday, and I thought I would try something different this year, and that is work through each of the days of Holy Week on that day. So, yesterday was Palm Sunday, and we worshiped and talked about the different expectations that the various groups of people in Jerusalem had about Jesus as he entered into the city. And today is Monday, the Monday of Holy Week, which is the day that Jesus cleanses the temple. And so I wanted to talk about what this event is and sort of what it means in the context of Holy Week and what it means for us as we approach not only Good Friday, where Jesus is crucified, but then also Easter Sunday as we celebrate Jesus's resurrection. So I mentioned yesterday that Jesus actually goes to the temple on Sunday night, and that's important. We'll get there in a moment, but I wanted to talk about what this temple is and what it represents for the people. It's difficult, I think, for a lot of us, particularly in Western religions, to really grasp the full weight of what the temple means because we just don't have temple centric religions. We don't have faith practices that are bound to a particular location. So the closest might be, I know in my denomination, Church of the Nazarene, we have a lot of camp meetings. And so a number of Nazarenes have these very strong, powerful spiritual experiences of God, these kind of almost mystical experiences that are tied to a particular camp where they went year after year growing up, or maybe to an altar at their college campus, possibly where they surrendered to a call in ministry or something like that. And so to return to those places, those particular geological places has a special meaning. And if they find out that, the university is remodeling the chapel or the campus closed and maybe moved somewhere else, there's a sense of mourning that can happen because that specific physical space is no longer available to them. That you're getting there, but for religions that are temple centric, the way ancient Judaism was, the way actually most religions in the world were until Judaism, really until the exile, until that changed. Uh, the temple is the place where heaven and earth overlap. They're two separate spheres. The heavens are where the gods live, and then earth is, of course, where we live. And the gods are dangerous. I think really in a way that we think of radioactivity as dangerous, right? It's not that the radioactive isotopes have a particular malice towards humanity. It's just that by their very nature, they can contaminate us and they can harm us. And that's sort of the way ancient peoples understood the holiness of the gods, is that just being in the presence of the god could be harmful, could be dangerous. And you see this several times in the Hebrew Bible. I think my favorite story of that is when King David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem from the Philistines, and the cart slips, and the Ark is going to fall off of the cart, and a guy reaches out and like catches it, and then he's struck dead. Right. And I mean, I remember even as a kid thinking, like, why would God do that? He was just protecting the ark. And preachers would talk about, well, he didn't have faith that God would protect it and all that. And that's really not what's going on there. What's going on there is simply that God's holiness is dangerous for us mere mortals. And so the fact, it was like reaching out and touching something and getting electrocuted. I say all of that to say the temple is what made interactions between humanity and God safe. It was set up almost think of it as progressive airlocks, right? Where at the very outside of the temple is the normal, ordinary world, and then as you get closer and closer to the center of the temple, to the holiest place, or the Holy of Holies, it's more and more and more dangerous. So they have these increasing levels of holiness. And again, remember, this is ancient imagery and ancient language, right? So you first had the court of the Gentiles, where people like me could go, people who are non-Jewish, people who are not part of the chosen people. And then you had the court of the men, where only Jewish men could go. And then inside of that was the priestly court, where anyone who was a priest could go. And then inside of that was the holy place, where only the high priest could go. And he could even only go into the Holy of Holies, or the holiest place, once a year, because it was so dangerous. And so when we understand it like that, what I think a way we can interpret what's going on in the temple is when God first gave Moses the let's call them blueprints. That's pretty anachronistic, right? The blueprints for the tabernacle, which is at Mount Sinai. That's when Israel receives the Ten Commandments and agrees to become God's people, and then they receive the full Torah, or the way. Part and parcel of that is the design of the tabernacle, which is basically a portable temple, right? The temple and the tabernacle, we don't even have time for all this, but like they sync up together really well. The temple is basically a double-sized and non-moving tabernacle, right? So going all the way back to the tabernacle and forward, this is a way that God has given the people to make it safe to be in close proximity and close relationship to God. It was an act of mercy and an act of grace, an act of love. It was God's way of saying, I want to be with you. And so I'm going to make a way. I'm going to make it possible for you to be with me in this very tangible way. And of course, it had all of these dangers, and it was fraught, and they had to be careful about how they navigated it. But the bottom line was, this was a way for God to dwell physically among the people. And so, again, there's a lot more fine print to this, talking about the way the first temple got destroyed in the exile when Babylon destroyed it, and then how it was rebuilt later. And then even the temple that we're talking about here was massively renovated by Herod the Great, the same Herod that tried to kill baby Jesus, right? But it has become at this point one of the premier temples in the world, and it rivals even some of the temples in Rome. So it's just this gorgeous, beautiful building. And this is Passover week. Passover's coming up, depending on which gospel you're looking at. It's either like Thursday or Friday, so just down the road. And you have just throngs and throngs of pilgrims who have come in, many of them whom entered the city with Jesus the day before the triumphal entry. And so what they're all doing is making sure they have all of the preparations ready for Passover to be able to celebrate the Seder meal. And part of that is having an animal sacrifice. And so they're coming into the temple, and there are literally just hundreds and thousands of people crowding in here, shouting, bartering for animals. And there was a scale even in the Torah of wealth. So if you were wealthy enough, you could go ahead and have your lamb for your sacrifices. But if you were poorer, there were provisions for offering birds, or offering other much more smaller and more readily available, cheaper animals. We actually see that when Jesus's parents bring him to the temple to get circumcised. They offer 2 turtle doves, which tells us that they were pretty poor, right? They were not part of the upper crust. And so, again, you just try to imagine this temple is packed with several different kinds of people. You have the people there who have brought the animals in, right? So they're trying to manage all of these animals that are being bought and sold. You have money changers, because this is Roman occupied Israel. And so you're not allowed to bring pagan coinage into the temple. You have to use the temple coin. And so these pilgrims who are coming from outside of Jerusalem, well, they don't have temple coin because they don't live near the temple, right? And so they're having to change their money over so that they can have the right kind of currency and not profane the temple by bringing this Gentile currency in. And then you have the pilgrims themselves who are buying and selling and negotiating. And again, I think if you've ever traveled anywhere outside of the West, and you've been in a bazaar or any place where you're expected to haggle, you know that just one transaction can be pretty loud. And when you just multiply that by hundreds or by thousands, all of these transactions, this is just a massive, massive, chaotic spread of people. And then into the middle of this comes Jesus and his temple cleansing. So I want to read this passage real quick from Mark's gospel. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the observations. And I'm actually going to start back in chapter 11 at the end of the triumphal entry, because I think it's important that we see, again, that Jesus shows up for the first time at the temple on Sunday. I said Sunday night earlier. It would be Sunday afternoon, right? Before sundown. So here we go. In verse 11 of Mark chapter 11, it says, "Then Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12 disciples." Okay. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. So he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard that. Then they came to Jerusalem. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." Then, when the chief priests and scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, now this is the next day, right? This is tomorrow, Tuesday. As they passed by, they saw the same fig tree withered away to its root. And then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed is withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer and believe you have received, it will be yours." Okay, so we're going to talk more about the Tuesday stuff, obviously, tomorrow. But I think it's important to note that the way we so often imagine this temple encounter is actually wrong. We imagine that Jesus just is beat bopping around Jerusalem, and he walks into the temple and he just flies into a rage and starts like punching people and flipping tables and all of that. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard this story referenced to justify violent action against other people. When we say, "Oh, it's not okay to respond to our enemies with violence," people go, "Well, remember, even Jesus cleansed the temple." Right. But I think it's important to note that this was not a spontaneous action, and I would argue it's actually not even a violent action. There is a New Testament scholar named Paula Fredrickson who wrote a really interesting, provocative book called Jesus of Nazareth. And she actually just kind of does the math on the temple, how big the temple courtyard was, how many hundreds and thousands of people were packed in there. And she points out that there's no way that Jesus's demonstration would have been able to disrupt all that much. I don't know if you've ever been to one of the college football games at one of the stadiums with 100,000 people. I went to an Ohio Buckeyes game one time, and that their stadium holds, I think it holds like 80,000 people or more, or something. I'm in this space. It's packed with people. Sold out game, and it's that sort of thing. Try to imagine being in one of those spaces and doing anything that would cause a disruption to even most of the people there, right? There's just no way that would happen. So what we see here, actually, rather than some sort of spontaneous reaction out of anger, and rather than some kind of violent action, is actually an act of creative disobedience, creative disruption. Jesus goes up on Sunday and he looks around and he sees what's going on there, and he says, "Okay, I'm going to come back tomorrow and I'm going to do something, right? I'm going to disrupt. I'm going to make a point." So Jesus leaves. He comes back the next day, and on the way, Mark's gospel interposes what's going on at the temple with this strange interaction with the fig tree, right? Where Jesus sees the fig, and Mark tells us, it's not even the season when figs grow, and then Jesus curses the fig tree, and then it dies, right? And the disciples are all like, "Whoa, kill this fig tree." Uh, this is important to note that the temple cleansing is bracketed by this story, where it's not season for figs, and yet Jesus is angry that there's not fruit on this tree. Because, of course, there is no season for fruitfulness at the temple, right? God's people ought to be fruitful all year long. That's one of the things we see in the vision that John gives us of the holy city of Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, at the end of Revelation, is that the tree of life grows in the middle of the city and it has fruit all 12 seasons. So again, this is all a very poetic way of saying Jesus is criticizing the temple, and by extension, God's people, for not being fruitful, for not caring for the vulnerable, for not lifting up and releasing those who are imprisoned. All of the things that he's been dedicating his ministry to, he's now come to the center of power, to the center of religion, and he's creating a public demonstration. So he's overturning the money changers' tables. He's driving animals out. He's refusing to let people buy and trade. None of what he's doing is actually physically harming anyone. And this is the part where someone goes, "But what about the whip?" Right? Yes. So one of the Gospels, the Gospel of John, mentions the whip. But it specifically says that Jesus is only using the whip to drive the animals out of the temple, which is what those whips were for, right? That it was just kind of herding the animals. And again, we can have a whole different conversation about the ethics of whipping animals to herd them. But the point is, he's not whipping people. He's not harming people. He's not there to hurt anyone. And we can see that actually by the response to him. right? Mark makes it pretty clear that Jesus is there all day. This was not a momentary disruption, but this is something he's doing all day. He's disrupting what's going on in some part of the courtyard, and he's teaching the whole day. And people end up being here for it. They're here for Jesus offering this fresh vision of good news. Probably a good number of the folks in the courtyard are people who were part of that big train of pilgrims that came down from Galilee with Jesus, many of whom were probably at the triumphal entry yesterday. And so they're gathered around, they're enraptured, and it's so spellbinding that the temple authorities, which would include the temple guard, right? They're afraid to move on Jesus. They kind of are just standing back at the sides, making sure that nothing goes wrong. And if you're wondering what this would look or feel like, think back to when Black Lives Matter protesters were blocking traffic, right? Or laying down in malls, in the center of malls during holiday shopping season, right? And so they're not harming anyone, but they're disrupting things. They're making people late for work, maybe, or they're keeping people from getting home. And they're trying to make the point that this small disruption that they have created for people is a drop in the bucket compared to the way that systemic racism disrupts the lives of Black Americans. And so again, they're doing this without harming anyone, but in a way that is certainly disruptive to the normal way of things. That's a similar thing to what we see Jesus doing in this so-called temple tantrum. Which, by the way, I forgot. I have this sweet image here. This is from El Greco. So it's Christ cleansing the temple, and I love. You can see here that Jesus. I mean, he looks angry, right? And you see all these people that are like clearly being harmed by him. You barely see even any animals at all. There's just like little kid laying off to the side that's like, oh, where are my parents? Why am I naked? Right? This is just such a different image of Jesus cleansing the temple than what we see in any of the four gospels. So what does that all mean for us during Holy Week? Well, yesterday I mentioned that this is sort of the moment where the crowds turn against Jesus, where they get angry with him and they start to realize that Jesus is not here to be the kind of Messiah they wanted, right? They thought Jesus was going to come for Rome, was going to attack them, kick Rome out and reestablish God's throne on earth. And yet what Jesus seems most interested with here is the character of the people of God. And so again, think about today the number of Christians who, we direct our anger all over the place at all kinds of other things in the world. And yet we don't begin with who we are and where we are. We don't start with how God needs to cleanse us from within, and instead we focus on everyone else. And when we do that, we set ourselves up to be part of the crowd on Friday that screams for Jesus's crucifixion, because this is the space where, because Jesus will not fight the same people we want him to fight, we turn on him and we say, well, if you're not going to do what I want, if you're not going to serve my agenda, then what good are you? So again, I hope at the beginning of this Holy Week, we can maybe create some space to allow Jesus to direct his attention at us. And we can hold some space for a cleansing of our own spirits and asking whether we really are embodying the gospel that Jesus came to announce, which is good news to the poor, release to the captives, sight to the blind, right? The care for the most vulnerable, that Jubilee year that cancels all debts and leads people into a space of justice and flourishing for everyone. We'll be back tomorrow to talk about when Jesus shows back up at the temple the next day and how he's reacted to then, and the sort of battle of wits that he gets into. So I would expect at least one Princess Bride reference. But until then, I hope your Holy Week is off to a good start. I hope you are finding yourself blessed and encouraged. And I hope you can join us Friday live at 7 p.m., either in this virtual space or in our building if you're local. And then, of course, on Easter Sunday at 10:30 in the morning. So grace and peace be with you this week, and I'll see you tomorrow morning.